Good evening, everyone. I am the Marginal Non-Hermit, and I have a little discussion today on civil libertarianism and some of its drawbacks by my perspective. This was kind of spurred by, I was reading a book by my favorite fiction author, who is Rex Stout. He created the characters Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin, among many others, and a long series of detective stories. There we go. I was reading this book, Death of a Dude, and at the start of chapter 9, there was a very interesting little exchange that I thought that made me start thinking about civil libertarianism and Rex Stout and the difficulties of such a position, the contradictions within it. So just to kind of give you an idea of what I was reading, here's a little description and a summary of what was going on here. So chapter 9 starts by, Nero Wolfe said to Woodrow Stepanian, "No. After full consideration, I might agree with you. I meant only what I said, that a majority of your fellow citizens would not." And what they're talking about is an item hanging on the wall behind Woody's desk, a big card in a homemade frame, which said in homemade lettering by Woody, quote, "All right then, I'll go to hell," unquote. Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Wolfe had asked why that had been chosen for display in a frame, and Woody had said because he thought it was the greatest sentence in American literature. Wolfe had asked why he thought that, and Woody had replied because it said the most important thing about America, that no man had to let anybody else decide things for him. And what made it such a wonderful sentence was that it wasn't a man who said it. It was a boy who had never read any books, and that showed that he was born with it because he was American. This made me think about the ideas of civil libertarianism, and Rex Stout in particular. Rex Stout, in his time, was well known as a civil libertarian. He was a strong voice during World War II and afterwards in favor of the quote-unquote civil libertarian position. But the civil libertarian position has some weaknesses, or perhaps flaws would be a better way to put them. And the main one is that civil libertarianism is basically a picking and choosing of what liberties to accept. The idea is that certain liberties are civil and thus are sacrosanct, and other liberties which are not civil are not necessarily sacrosanct. Now, you have to separate all of the liberties into these two categories, and there are a few ways to do that. I'll list a couple here. The first two are, namely, that liberties are what I say they are, or liberties are what the state says they are. These two are quite possibly the worst ways to define civil liberties, because not only are they applicable to the most evil dictator, but they are also not necessarily under the control of any particular principle. So if I say that your liberties are what I say they are, what I'm really saying is that I own you. And if I say that liberties are what the state says they are, well, that's a hole with usually a very shallow bottom. Another way to define what liberties are civil is that liberties are what society agrees upon. But of course the problem with this is society is not a blob that you can decide what it means. And what this generally means in practice is that a liberty that 51% of the population believes is good is sacrosanct, and a liberty that 49% of the population thinks is good is easily destroyed. Another way that you could define civil liberties is that you could use a document or a principle, and a straightforward reading or logical conclusions could define which liberties are civil. But of course, this has the flaw that it doesn't necessarily encompass everything. A document is finite. A principle is finite. And so you might discover later on that a situation that is not described by the document or conceived of by the principle are deserving of liberty, but now you can't defend it. So, with that said, thinking more about Rex Stout again, and although I love his fiction, I think his politics were kind of weird, because there's a lot of what I would call hero worship, of pretty awful people in Rex Stout's stuff. It's hard to tell whether he means it, whether he's... It doesn't feel like satire most of the time. To give you an example, the character Woodrow Stepanian is named after Woodrow Wilson, who I consider to be one of the 20th century's greatest monsters. And he says that he was originally named Theodore after Theodore Roosevelt, another monster, and he had considered changing his name to Franklin after FDR, another monster. And so this admiration of these autocratic monsters by a person who believes that being American, and I'm talking about the character now, by a character, a person, Woodrow, who believes that being American means that you can say that you will go off to hell on your own, regardless of what anyone else says, is a very strange contradiction to me. It doesn't make a lot of sense. It seems ironic that a civil libertarian would say things in favor of Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, and even in other places, Rex Stout has, or characters written by Rex Stout have expressed that somehow taxation is just in some way. So this is one of those things that I've had to grapple with in reading these stories, that it's just very contradictory. Getting back to the principle of civil libertarianism, I want to talk a little bit about probably the most well-known icon of civil libertarianism in the United States, which would be the American Civil Liberties Union. And though they have occasionally done some good work, they too pick and choose kind of at random, and not merely on a left-right basis, at least not back in the day. Back in the day, the American Civil Liberties Union defended Nazi speech in Skokie, Illinois. And although they've admitted that they probably wouldn't be able to do that now, they did do it in the past. And they have never, to the best of my understanding, they have never been good on the right to keep and bear arms. Even though I would consider the right to keep and bear arms a very important right that should be protected, the American Civil Liberties Union has not seen it that way, ever. Not even when they were defending what they would have called extreme right-wing speech, whether the Nazis were right-wing or not, notwithstanding. And so, this organization that claims to be in favor of civil liberties is in favor of some liberties, but against other liberties that I think a reasonable person can think are very important. And this is a huge tension in their existence. It makes it difficult for someone to support a group that sometimes does good things and sometimes does horrible things, makes horrible arguments against people defending themselves from criminals and tyrants. This kind of inconsistency in the notion of what makes a civil libertarian is why I consider myself an anarchist or an ANCAP or whatever you want to call me along those lines, and not a civil libertarian. And of course, the ANCAP position has its own difficulties. It's a very absolute position. It leads to some difficulties. For instance, I can't attack actions that don't affect me or someone I'm pledged to protect directly. So there may be actions that a person commits that I believe to be morally repugnant, but because their acts do not affect me or anyone that I have an agreement to protect, I'm not able to use physical means to prevent those actions from going through. I can use speech to try to persuade people not to go through with those actions, but the limits on what I can do just because I think something is morally repugnant are limited. So that's all. I just wanted to talk a little bit about civil libertarianism and also plug, Rex Stout. If you like very well-written detective stories, Rex Stout stuff is amazing. My favorite fiction author, I've got most of his books at this point, a lot of them in first editions, which sounds more impressive than it really is. There were a lot of prints of them, and they were printed in large quantities at first printing. But it's still kind of nice to have all these really old hardcover books on my shelf sometimes. Anyway, thank you for listening. I am the Marginal Non-Hermit once again, and this has been discussion on civil libertarianism. So thank you for what I just said that. Anyway, see you all later.